Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. Hello and welcome to Be with a Beacon, a program organized by Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda Cultural Center, Shillong, to connect and interact with people who have left a mark behind and whose works will continue to inspire posterity. The interactions are organized either in person or online. Today is the episode 2 of the program. Today we are indeed fortunate to have with us Dr. Jeffery D Long, Professor of Religion and Asian Studies, Elizabethtown College. He is associated with the Vedanta Societies of Ramakrishna Order in the United States, and he is also associated with Dharma Academy of North America and Hindu American Foundation. He has also done an extensive research in religious pluralism. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So, Jeffrey, you have long been into the research connected with Hinduism and Oriental studies. So, could you please brief our listeners about your research?
Okay, so my research has actually been pretty wide-ranging. I have a variety of interests. So I've done a good deal of work on what scholars generally call classical Indian philosophy, so Sanskrit works on texts like sutras and other texts from traditions like Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, Yoga, Vedanta, and so on. I've also taken up a strong interest in Jainism, Jain philosophy, and I've done my doctoral dissertation was actually on Jain philosophy and on the Jain doctrine Anekantavad, which I think has a very interesting connection with the teaching of Sri Ramakrishna. And I've also, of course, been doing work connected to the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and modern Hinduism. And in fact, my most recent book, it's coming in September. It's on Hinduism in America. So that's a topic that has been of great interest to me as well. So from ancient India to contemporary America, but themes relating to mostly to Hindu traditions, but also Jainism. And when I was in graduate school, I did a lot of coursework on Buddhism as well. A lot of my teaching is in relation to Buddhism. So my interests cover a lot of different things. But the central driving force, I think, of my work has been Sri Ramakrishna's teaching that there are many paths to the infinite. There are many ways to achieve realization. And this concept, which in the Western world philosophers call pluralism, is something that I think is extremely important. And it's an idea that I've pursued in all of my work. It's really the thread that ties together the studies of Jainism, the studies of Hinduism in America, and so forth. The idea that we should look on many paths with respect as ways of getting closer to the realization of our inherent divinity, and that there'd be far less conflict in the world if we thought in a way, rather than in the way many people think of their religions. They think, okay, this is the truth, it's the only truth, and it's the only way. And this has caused, of course, a lot of division, a lot of warfare in history. As Swami Vivekananda says, sectarianism, fanaticism, bigotry, these have all caused so much violence. So the way that Ramakrishna teaches, I think, is the antidote to this this type of violence. So that's been the larger theme of my work.
Okay. Yes, great that your work is motivated with the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. But you have also mentioned that you have done extensive research on these sutras, Nyaya, and other Indian systems of philosophy.
Yes.
So, how do you connect? You must also be well versed with the Western philosophy also and the Indian system. And do you think that Sri Ramakrishna connects as a bridge between Western and Indian philosophies? And how does he connect with the this Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sutras, etc.? That not the central theme of the philosophy, but if we take a bird's eye view, then where does Sri Ramakrishna stand? You think uh, in this in this context?
Okay, that's a wonderful question. So I'll look at both aspects. First, the second question you asked about how Sri Ramakrishna connects with all of these, very technical systems of philosophy that were developed in India since ancient times, and I see him in many ways as a unifying figure. And in fact, this process of unification was underway even before the time of Sri Ramakrishna, because when we look back to ancient India, like today, for example, we use this term Hinduism or Hindu Dharma to kind of encompass a lot of different schools of thought. At one time, these schools of thought were very much in conflict with one another, not violent conflict, but intellectual conflict, a lot of debate. And so we read, for example, of how Adi Shankaracharya traveled throughout the country debating with not only with Buddhists and with Jains, but also with other people that we would today regard as Hindu, followers of the various other darshanas, other systems of philosophy. And over time, I think what has happened is there's been a gradual process by which Indian scholars began to perceive that these various systems of philosophy could be integrated as focusing on a specific facet of reality. So, for example, Nyaya is all about logic and the pramanas, the modes of knowledge, and its basic system can be employed by someone who's an adherent of Advaita Vedanta, for example. So there's really not, even though there may be specific doctrines where the Nyaya school and Advaita Vedanta differ, their system of logic can be employed by someone who is an adherent of Advaita Vedanta. Similarly, we know Shankaracharya is believed to have commented upon yoga texts, Sankhya texts, for example. There are affinities there as well. So this process of unification, I think, was underway. And there's another scholar, Andrew Nicholson, wrote a really nice book called Unifying Hinduism a few years ago. And he focuses on not an Advaita Vedanta scholar, but Vijnana Bhikshu, who's from the Bheda system of Vedanta, and how he assimilated and incorporated yoga, Sankhya, Nyaya, Vaisheshika into his understanding of Vedanta. It was sort of a more holistic understanding. So there were movements already occurring in this direction. What I see Sri Ramakrishna is doing is he resolved all of these things through his direct experience. So for Sri Ramakrishna, I think the logic part is secondary, right? In fact, it can even be a distraction. But I think this is where maybe Swami Vivekananda can be kind of a bridge between those of us who are maybe a little more intellectually inclined and Sri Ramakrishna, because he was able to express this philosophically. And there's been a recent book that's really very good by he's just recently become a Swami of the Ramakrishna order, Swami Medhananda, and his book was published under his pre-monastic name of Vayan Maharaj, and called Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. He also showed that even though Sri Ramakrishna himself was not very fond of philosophizing, there's very profound philosophy actually in his teaching, that if you perceive of ultimate reality as having infinite aspects, infinite dimensions, then what appear to be contradictory systems of thought can actually be resolved because they're looking at one particular aspect of the whole rather than at the totality. And this is actually what drew me to the study of Jain philosophy, because the Jains say something very similar in their Anikantavada doctrine, that reality is multifaceted. So when people in Advaita Vedanta talk about the permanent, unchanging, eternal Brahman, and Buddhists, for example, talk about the impermanent, constantly changing, momentary nature of existence, they're not necessarily contradicting each other because they're looking at different facets of the totality of being. And I think Western philosophy can play very much of a role here, because that the other part of your question was, how does this connect with Western philosophy? And Western philosophy has also been looking for a kind of unifying theory, right? A unified field theory as such in the realm of philosophy. And one figure that I've studied a lot and that I found particularly useful in this regard was Alfred North Whitehead, who developed a system of thinking which has come to be called process philosophy or process metaphysics. And I first became aware of this actually through studying Christian theology, because there's a group of progressive Christian theologians who are very interested in interfaith dialogue. They have a very broad-minded approach to the study of Christianity, and they found Whitehead's approach to be useful to them. And when I took a course on Whitehead in graduate school, I thought, well, this sounds more like Ramanuja than Christianity. It's actually very, very similar to Indian philosophy. And I sometimes joke that I think Whitehead probably was an Indian philosopher in a previous life. Maybe it's not a joke, and maybe he was. Um, we know that he had some knowledge of Indian philosophy, but um, not I think, enough to account for the depth of the and the detail of the ways in which his philosophy, in effects, replicates certain facets of Indian systems. I think a lot of this came to him intuitively, and just in the process of rationally thinking through the nature of being. But Whitehead was concerned to integrate religion and science and philosophy. That in Western thought, these have become split apart. Um, there was a time when Western thought was a little more like Indian thought. Philosophy was a kind of unifier, and philosophers studied everything from uh, God to the nature of plants and animals. All right, all of this was philosophy. In fact, what we now call science was termed natural philosophy. But at a certain point, there was a split between these things because, of course, a variety of complex reasons, historical reasons are there. But science came to be associated entirely with the empirical study of the phenomenal world, the sensory world, and theorizing about its nature. And this became completely separate from the realm of religion and spiritual practice, which was the realm of faith. And a lot of this had to do with political conflicts because when Christianity ruptured into many different sects, the Catholic Church on one side and then the Protestant reformers on the other, there's a lot of warfare that came from this, a lot of destruction. And so eventually, in my country and in what became the United States, and then later in Europe and much of the world, the decision was made to separate religion from government, separate church and state, so people could believe whatever they like about religion as long as it doesn't disrupt the society. And so religion became a very private thing. It became a matter of personal faith. And unfortunately, I think for many people, it became separated from rationality. And so then you get the rise of fanaticism, right? You get more sort of fundamentalist movements and this kind of thing. Because if you look at the earlier period of Christianity, if you look at the medieval period, usually people look at the Middle Ages and say, "Oh, people were not as smart then." But there were great scholars and saints who were reconciling faith and reason in a way very similar to things that you find in Indian philosophy. So there's very interesting dialogue that can be had between the thought of Shankaracharya, for example, and the thought of Thomas Aquinas in the Catholic tradition. But there was this rupture between faith and reason in the modern period. And of course, this is why so many people who are rationally minded are now very dismissive of religion. And they're correct to be if religion means just the sort of blind fanaticism. But Whitehead understood that you really need reason and faith together to have an integrated life and an integrated understanding of reality. In fact, I receive a Swami Vivekananda quote of the day every day in my email. And just a few days ago, the quote was a very beautiful one. He says, um, uh, "Philosophy without religion is dry and dead, and religion without philosophy is fanaticism." So you really need these two together. And in fact, Whitehead and Swamiji were contemporaries, but I don't think they ever met or had any interaction. But um, the system, I think, is sort of a movement within Western philosophy, which brings it closer in its sensibility to Indian philosophy. And I think another figure I would just want to mention in response to your question here is Sri Aurobindo, who also beautifully integrates both Western and Indian thought. And he too saw himself as being in a line of continuity with Swamiji and with Sri Ramakrishna. And if you read The Life Divine, for example, which is a massive book, it's a huge undertaking, but it's very similar to Whitehead's thinking. And Aurobindo is in this very unusual position of having mastered both European and Indian philosophy. He knew both extremely well. So he's able to show the points of continuity and how in the Western system you're looking at how consciousness emerges from the material world, and in the Indian system you're seeing how consciousness enters into the material world. So this sort of evolution and involution dynamic, and actually those terms were coined by Swami Vivekananda, evolution and involution as complementary aspects of the same process. And I think he got this all from Sri Ramakrishna, got it not study but just through his very powerful and spontaneous experiences.
Yeah, thank you very much for this wonderful answer, connecting both the Eastern philosophy and the Western philosophy. Because what we need today is a synthesis. Because the world is today, you see, we are connecting with you in through video conferencing. Through we are connected just as a global village, and thought also is connected like that. When you told that there can be a dialogue between Shankaracharya and Thomas Aquinas, then I remembered a quotation by Shankaracharya. In Mani Ratnamala, Shankaracharya says that Kim Shastra Sarvesham. He says yuktihi. That means logic is the shastra, scripture for all. So if we anchor ourselves to logic, then I think this dialogue is possible. Just the way you wonderfully connected the Eastern side, Eastern thought, and Western thought. So it's just like that.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. Yes. Am I audible?
Yes, absolutely. I'm hearing you very, very well.
Yeah. So you have mentioned about Whitehead's process metaphysics and Swami Medhananda's latest work that you refer to, that is on Vijnana Vedanta, as we know. So this is the philosophical part that we have been discussing. And as you say, as you have already said, that Sri Ramakrishna was not much for this philosophizing things, but he led the life, and Swami Vivekananda read the meaning.
Right.
So there is, and in the process of synthesis, I think there is another aspect that we must focus on. That is the cultural aspect.
Yes.
And in this connection, it's very interesting that your next book that is coming out is Hinduism and America.
Yes.
You were born and brought up there in the United States, and you were closely associated with the ideas of Sri Ramakrishna and this Indic thought. Then, my question is, how do you culturally connect to this this thought process, which could have been alien
Yes.
to many of us? So it's a cultural aspect that we are concerned about. So how do you address that gap? How do you bridge that gap? That's
a wonderful
thing I
question.
would like to know.
Yeah, this is where a lot of my attention has been focused in the last couple of years, especially as I've worked on that book, and was one of the things that really inspired me to write that book. What I discovered, and I'm not the first to discover it. I think the pioneer here is probably Philip Goldberg, who wrote a wonderful book called American Veda. And in fact, he interviewed me in the course of writing that book. And one of the things that he writes about, and I've also delved into this in my book, is the extent to which often without most Americans being aware of it. Many of us have already been shaped by Hindu thought and Hindu culture in a sort of unconscious way because of there are many, many factors involved. But the short version of the story is that when Swami Vivekananda came to the US in the 1890s and began establishing Vedanta societies, after his passing, his brother monks came and continued to build and sustain those societies. Many of the people who were drawn to Vedanta, and I'm thinking now in the early 20th century, like the 1920s, 1930s, and 40s, people like Christopher Isherwood, Aldous Huxley, Joseph Campbell, Houston Smith, these were very scholarly, very smart people who were connected with the world of art and literature and the intellect. So they were not ordinary people. They had the capacity to greatly influence the culture around them. And so you would get you have those sort of that original core of Westerners drawn to Vedanta who are deeply intellectual, who are writers, who are artists, who are uh, today we would call them influencers, right? That's the term that has come about. So you have these influencers, and then you have a group that is influenced by them. They don't necessarily have direct contact with Vedanta or with Hindu thought, but they have indirect contact through reading people like Joseph Campbell or Aldous Huxley. And then they, in turn, among them were also many cultural influencers. And those people have had a tremendous influence on Western culture. I'm thinking, for example, of George Lucas, who created the Star Wars films. He has the figure of Yoda, who in many ways is like Sri Ramakrishna. He's sort of, when you first meet him in The Empire Strikes Back, right? He's sort of this like a mad monk, right? He defies conventional expectations, but then he's shown to have profound wisdom and spiritual power. And George Lucas once said of Joseph Campbell, he said he was my Yoda. Joseph Campbell was the one who instructed him about spirituality. Well, Joseph Campbell was close to Swami Vivekananda at the New York Vivekananda Center. So you have this sort of transmission coming via you have the people who originally come to Vedanta, and then they spread the ideas to others who then have the capacity to implant it in the larger culture. Another big cultural force. In fact, I have my Beatles teacup here. This is the music of the Beatles, and that is a tremendous cultural influence. There, I'd say, very few individuals who've had a greater influence on Western culture today than those four young men from Liverpool with their music and their whole sensibility. And at a certain point, the four of them, especially George Harrison, they'd reached the pinnacle of fame, the pinnacle of material success, and found, of course, as we know, that that does not bring true happiness. And so they began seeking and searching for something more. And George Harrison found it in meditation. And he was one of the early supporters of the Hare Krishna movement in the West, transcendental meditation. And this pervaded his music. He had uh, big hit songs like My Sweet Lord, for example, it has the Hare Krishna mantra contained in the song. And so you have Westerners walking along and listening to the radio and singing Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, So I mean, there it goes. I mean, the chant, the power behind that. This has really infused the Western culture, I think, to such an extent that I think just as India in many ways has become somewhat more Americanized and more westernized, I see many people in America becoming more what we might think of traditionally as Indian. So, for example, uh, religious boundaries have typically in India not been very harsh and rigid. People celebrate each other's holidays, people go to each other's temples, and there's sort of this very easy blending of traditions, which made Sri Ramakrishna's life, and his type of path possible. Well, now a lot of our young people will, if you ask them about their religion, they'll say, "Well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious." They don't want to identify with one specific religion and say only that is true. And if you talk to them and ask them about their specific beliefs, you'll find there's some Christianity, there's some Buddhism, there's some Hinduism, there's a little bit of everything, and there's some science. And because there's this understanding that truth is everywhere, and that we're all on a quest for truth. And of course, that comes straight from the Ramakrishna movement. So I think superficially, the cultures are as different as can be. But if you start to dig beneath the surface, you find there's actually a lot of interesting synergy going on. And my book documents a lot of this. One example from the 19th and early 20th centuries, Henry David Thoreau, as he recounts in his book Walden, he reads from the Bhagavad Gita and is deeply inspired by that. And then young Mohandas Gandhi reads Henry David Thoreau and is in turn inspired to start a nonviolent resistance movement. And so you have this sort of back and forth influence. And then Gandhi's nonviolent movement influences Martin Luther King's nonviolent movement in America. So I think there's a lot more synergy between India and the West than is often understood. And there's still a lot of ignorance. The same people who might actually be very deeply influenced on some level by Hindu thought, because they're not aware of the sources of these ideas, they might still have very negative stereotypes about India and Hinduism. They may, oh, Hinduism, that's the one with the cows, right? I mean, they don't really know, about the philosophy, but the philosophy's there. And so it's a matter of what we have to do as scholars is connect the dots for people. So these ideas that you really like, this practice of yoga that you do every day, this all comes from this source in India.
True indeed. The cultural differences are superficial, and if we dig deep within, we can find synergy between them. So it's very true, because after all, we are all human beings. Cultural issues are there, but the core of culture, that is always about being human.
Yeah.
So it's no different in the United States, in India, in Japan, in China, anywhere.
Right.
Very true, Jeffrey. Another thing I thought of asking you, when I received your first email,
Mm-hmm.
The intriguing fact that you have one of the quotations of Holy Mother Sarada Devi in your signature.
Yes.
Where Mother says, one who makes a habit of prayer and meditation will easily overcome all difficulties and remain calm and unruffled in the midst of the trials of life.
Yes.
So it is indeed soothing to read such a quotation in an email signature. And especially at a time like this, when the fear is looming large, the fear of pandemic is looming large, then how do you think prayer and spiritual life can help us in sustaining the pandemic?
So I think this is a wonderful question. And
Surviving the pandemic, rather.
yeah, how do these things help us survive the pandemic? And there's a wonderful quote actually from Whitehead, which has a very Vedantic feel to it. And he's trying to define religion, and he says, religion is what human beings do with our solitude. And there a lot of people you find, I've always enjoyed solitude. So it would be wrong to say that I'm enjoying the pandemic. I don't enjoy other people's suffering. I think it's a terrible thing, but I don't mind being right here in this place. It doesn't disturb me. I enjoy it, but I know that most people don't. A lot of people become very uncomfortable when they have to be alone for a period of time. Now, I live here with my wife, so we're not alone, but we have very similar personalities, and so we can for a long time like there's like nonverbal communication. Like you can be completely silent in our house, but we're both here, doing our work and carrying on. But a lot of people don't like it. They become very uncomfortable in solitude. And what happens, I think, is if you're by yourself, it almost forces you to then think about these deeper questions of existence. Who am I? Why am I here? What is my life for? What am I doing? What is life? And many people are not comfortable with those questions. They're very unsettled and disturbed by them. So they distract themselves with conversation with other people about other topics, entertainment, and so on. And I think if you have a spiritual practice where even when you're busy, right? Even before the pandemic, when we were, active and engaged, I was teaching groups of students and in person instead of online, and so on. If every day you were taking some time just to be by yourself, to meditate, to reflect, to just sit and breathe deeply and just be for a period of time, that I think serves us well during this time of pandemic, because we realize that deeper consciousness that we experience when we meditate is always there. It's always present. And it's present even when we're not paying attention to it, right? It's present even when we're caught up in, a crowd of people and conversations and outside events and so forth. And so if people feel very strong fear now during this pandemic, they can, if they do some spiritual practice, they can take assurance that this deeper consciousness, this reality which we call the self, the Atman, the God within, is always there and nothing can destroy it. Even if we die of a terrible disease, that's the body dying. It's not our consciousness. It's not what we really are at the core of our being. And until you actually have that experience, that's just a matter of faith, right? It's like, well, I hope there is something, beyond this life. But if you practice regularly, you start to experience more from the center of your being and identify less with the physical body, more with that core of consciousness. And that's deeply reassuring because that core of consciousness is there no matter what else is going on. And I always think of the image of the Shiva Nataraj, where he's dancing. And even while this sort of wild dance of creation is happening, which is this whole universe, the face of the image is very serene. He's not disturbed by any of this that's going on. Or I sometimes also think of the image of the eye of a hurricane. You have a hurricane, we have this massive wind and rain and all kinds of disturbance and violence. But at the center of it, there's this very calm place. So we need to learn to identify with that eye of the hurricane within ourselves. And daily spiritual practice, I think, is the key to that. And when I began meditating every day, I first meditated when I was very young. I was about 8 or 9 years old when I actually learned from a Catholic nun how to meditate. And then at different times in my life, I would meditate daily, and then one day I would wake up and say, okay, I want to sleep for another half hour instead of meditating. And so then I would stop meditating for maybe several months, and then I would go back to it. And once I started meditating regularly, once I took Diksha actually in the from a Swami in the Ramakrishna order, I've meditate every day, twice a day. And I find that if I look back on my life, the times when I meditated regularly, I felt happier, I was physically more healthy, uh, everything was easier to handle. And it doesn't make your life's problems go away, but it makes them easier to accept. And so, since I've been meditating daily, regularly, I've just found that it's much easier to accept the things that happen and not become too agitated by it. And maybe some of this also just comes from getting older now. This body's now 51 years old. So things that would upset me when I was in my 20s, now I think, well, I've seen that happen before. It's okay. It will pass and be replaced by something else. So I think spiritual practice helps us accept what happens around us and not let it disturb our inner tranquility. And when we're in that state, then we're also, like you mentioned, logic earlier. We can approach things more rationally. And instead of approaching things with emotion and becoming panicked. We panic when we don't really understand the situation. People are frightened of something they can't see. So it's a disease. What do we do? So we have to educate ourselves. We have to learn about science and learn about how these things work. And having a spiritual practice helps us maintain that mental calm that helps us look at things in a scientific way and not be so totally upset by it and overcome by it.
Yeah, wonderful indeed. That how you have imbibed the spirit of religion. Because philosophy is one thing, culture is one thing, and leading the life and imbibing the basic tenets of the philosophy that we are living by is more important than the subject itself, because it has to come handy. If we have something, we have to put it to use.
Yes.
Well, Jeffrey, we have this Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda Cultural Center. That is the place where Swami Vivekananda delivered his last public lecture.
Yes.
Now it has bloomed into a cultural center. There are several, almost 5 to 6,000 students in a year who study vocational trainings in computer. They have language training, and they also have art training and many other streams we have. So mainly it's a center for the youth. As we have discussed the philosophy, the culture, and finally the most important part, meditation and leading a spiritual life, to how to connect philosophy with our life. What should be your message for the youth?
Okay, so and I interact with youth a lot because of teaching college, and I find the youth in America and the youth in India are increasingly facing the same issues. There's a lot of anxiety about finding employment. There's a lot of anxiety about having an economically productive life and a fulfilling life. And in fact, the traditional model of getting married and having a family, even that, people are postponing, I find in both countries, because they're so worried about first just becoming economically secure. And so there's a lot of anxiety. And so what I would recommend to the young people is really I think what I would recommend to everyone, but I think it's especially important for the young people, is to, in the midst of all of their responsibilities, everything they need to do to ensure their education, to ensure their economic prosperity, to take a little bit of time every day for this practice of meditation and self-reflection. And they'll find that it sustains them, that it helps reduce anxiety. I have a lot of students in America. I don't know if this is as true in India, but a lot of them take a lot of medication for anxiety. And of course, we have to listen to what the doctors say and to what the scientists say. But I have this little motto of more meditation, less medication. That if you do this practice regularly, you'll find the need for things like that becomes much less, because your mind is already more calm, and you're able to address your problems again, like we were saying, logically and without so much fear. There's a lot of fear in the world. And I mentioned Star Wars earlier, and there's this great line in one of the movies. Yoda says, "Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering." Right? It's when people are so full of fear and anxiety that they're more likely to also fall prey to the other negative emotions, and so you get rioting and you get problems between communities and so on. This happens more when people feel insecure. So if we can cultivate a greater sense of inner security, that will make us better able to function in the material world and ensure our economic security. And then that will filter out into the whole society, because when people feel secure, both emotionally, mentally, spiritually, but also materially, then they aren't as inclined to get angry or blame others for their problems. They're solving their problems in a rational way. So I think this practice of meditation is really foundational for everybody. Everyone should. And I have a good friend. He's a Buddhist monk. He's a Theravada monk. He comes and speaks in my classes every year for a session, and he teaches the students some meditation, and he tells them even 5 minutes a day, right? Sounds very brief, but even 5 minutes a day, if you do it every day, it's going to affect your sense of well-being and calm you down. And I also teach my students some meditation outside of class, and some of them have written about the experience, and they say, right away, whatever anxiety they were having, it passed very quickly while they were meditating. And if they just do that every day, it becomes a habit to be able to dismiss that anxiety and then be more productive, whether it's in their studies or their work or whatever it might be.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for your the sound and practical suggestion for the youth. They can, of course, follow it. It's not something theoretical, it's very, very practical.
That's right.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much for being with us. I wish that this could go on and on, but there must be somewhere we should stop. And another thing, we are meeting in an unusual way, but maybe that is the usual way a couple of years down the line.
Yes.
So
yes. I think some of the new habits that we are developing during the pandemic will continue beyond the pandemic. And I know I'm becoming much more comfortable with this kind of online interaction now.
I think this has to be.
Yes.
Okay, thank you once again. We will end our interaction with you with a prayer for all. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayah Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschit Dukkha Bhaga Bhavet. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.